I'm very honored to be here as we celebrate the legacy of Dorothy Hussain, for whom this lecture is named. A 1964 graduate of Maumee Valley Hospital School of Nursing, Dottie Hussain's distinguished nursing career spanned 32 years as a staff nurse and a critical care nurse. Her professional career included working locally at Maumee Valley Hospital of Toledo, Detroit General Hospital, St. Vincent Medical Center in Toledo, Medical College of Ohio, and at the University of Toledo Medical Center. She was a mentor of young nurses, medical students, and residents, as well as an avid champion for patients' rights. As a two-time recipient of the University of Toledo Medical Center Nursing Excellence Award, she was recognized for her clinical acumen, passion for the nursing profession, and willingness to go beyond the call of duty. Her professional career also took her abroad as an invited visiting lecturer to the first teaching hospital in Beijing, China, and West China, University of Medical Sciences in Chengdu, China. Dottie was a world traveler with her surgeon and writer husband, who you'll meet shortly, Dr. S. Amjad Hussain, and moved seamlessly between cultures and traditions. Together, they had 3 children, Kari, Tasha, and Mani, and 4 grandchildren. In 2006, at the age of 62, sadly, Dottie passed away from ovarian cancer. The distinguished lectureship that we're celebrating this evening was established in her honor through the Hussain Family Fund at the Toledo Community Foundation. Today, Dr. Hussain's children are with us virtually, and I now invite Mani Hussain to make a few brief remarks. Mani is joining us from San Francisco. Let's talk a little bit about our distinguished moderator for the evening. Our tradition with the Hussain Lecture each year is to address important issues in the world of healthcare. We continue this tradition today, focusing on COVID-19, health disparities, and social inequities. Before I turn the microphone here over to Dr. S. Amjad Hussain, who will introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to tell you a little bit about his distinguished career. Dr. Hussain is an emeritus professor of cardiovascular surgery at the University of Toledo College of Medicine and an emeritus professor of humanities in the College of Arts and Letters. In 2009, the University of Toledo announced the creation of the S. Amjad Hussain Endowed Professorship in Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery in recognition of his many achievements. He also has an endowed lectureship series named after him, and that's focused on the medical humanities. He served on the University of Toledo Board of Trustees from 2007 to 2016 and is still very active with us here in a number of ways at the university, and we're very happy to have him still with us. He's also taken on leadership roles in numerous organizations in the greater Toledo area. He's an accomplished photographer, international explorer, and an author with over 20 books published. In fact, he has a new book out called A Tapestry of Medicine and Life. I'm going to now introduce Dr. Hussain, and he can introduce Mani if he is able to join us from San Francisco. Dr. Hussain.
Thank you, Dr. Lewandowski, for that very kind and generous introduction. I wish I could say that I wrote it for her, but I didn't. This has become a wonderful annual tradition at the University of Toledo to have this lecture. It's the first year out of 12 years that now we are doing it in a virtual format. But I hope that next year things will settle down and we will have it, the lectureship in person. COVID has been in the center of the news cycle since February of this year. And we can see that it has affected all aspects of life for us at every level that we can think of. So it is appropriate to have COVID-related topics for this lecture series. And I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brian Dolce. He's a graduate of Wayne State University, Detroit. Dr. Brian Dolce was trained at the University of Michigan in internal medicine, cardiology, and subsequently in interventional cardiology. Currently, he is a member of the ProMedica Cardiology Group. Dr. Dorsey is active in local community activities, including the Barbershop Health Initiative. He is the recipient of ProMedica Philanthropy Champion of the Year Award. He has been an outstanding spokesman on behalf of the medical profession in informing the public about the impact of COVID-19. In addition, he has participated in international missions, such as in Dominican Republic. So please welcome Dr. Brian Dolce.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the warm introduction, Dr. Hussain. How much do I owe you? Gotcha. Well, I just want to say thanks to start off. Thanks to the University of Toledo for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Thanks to Dr. Hussain, again, for that warm introduction. Thanks to Dean Lewandowski. We really appreciate her leadership here in getting this all put together. Also want to say thanks to Susan Wilson, who's the Director of Development for the College of Nursing and Pharmacy. And I want to say thanks to everyone in the audience who's out there watching and checking things out. Let's get on to our talk today. My name is Brian Dolce. I'm one of the cardiologists for ProMedica Physicians Cardiology. I've been with that group for about 11 years now. My beautiful wife, Dion, is in the audience as well. We've got 2 kids, Jonathan and Brandon, 17 and 15. I want to talk a little bit about healthcare disparities today and talk a little bit about racial inequities and how it's affecting everyone and how COVID-19 really has kind of brought this out and showed how much of an issue it is today in our country. For our next slide, this is my office. This is where I work. And I go to work very happily every day, and we see a lot of sick patients. And one sick patient in particular, I want to talk to you guys about. I want everybody out there to look at this EKG and kind of sear it in your mind. This is a very sick person. So this is someone who's having a major heart attack. They're having an ST elevation MI. And what's really striking about this EKG is that. So these go up and then they come back down. And that's something that we call tombstones. Meaning that if we don't do something about that right away, this patient may die. And I remember this case so distinctly because this is the gentleman. He's 53 years old. He works as a truck driver. He's smoking. He's living his life. He hadn't seen a doctor in over 10 years. He falls down, passes out in the middle of his living room. His sister, who is a nurse, starts CPR. They get the EMS there within minutes, shock him, and get him back to life. And they bring him into the hospital, and they show me this EKG, and I know we've got a major problem. So we get him to the cath lab. He's got an occluded left circumflex, and he also has a occluded right coronary artery. The left circumflex opened up pretty easily. I was able to open that up with one stent. The right was a little bit more challenging, but we were able to finally get that open. And once we got it open, I'm coming out and I'm taking off my gown, and one of our nurses who is in the control room says, "Thank you for saving my uncle's life." And I will never forget that for the rest of my life, because that just showed us how close we are and how connected people are. And they may be connected in ways that you never really anticipate. So that's kind of the key story that I want to highlight there. So a little bit more about myself. I'm from Detroit, born and raised Northwest Detroit, right south from 6 Mile. Then we moved to Highland Park, which is right in the middle of the city. Where you at, Highland Park? There you go. So moved to Highland Park when I was maybe about 11 or 12. And that was a big thing for me. This is my family. So that's my grandfather, paternal grandfather over there on the right, my paternal grandmother with him, my two parents, Deborah and Larry Dulcie, as well as my maternal grandparents. So just so you can know a little bit about me, these people taught me all the values that I have today. So if you attribute anything good to me, it's because of them. They are the cornerstone of what has made me me. They have taught me hard work. They've taught me intellectual curiosity. They gave me a strong foundation, and they also gave me a good sense of self. As far as intellectual curiosity, I owe it all to my mother. It wouldn't be a day that I wouldn't come home and she wasn't reading, say, Nikki Giovanni or Toni Morrison or Alice Walker or Ralph Ellison. So she taught me early on how to be curious, how to go out and read, and she taught me that readers are leaders. So those are the things that I learned from them. That's my brother. So anybody that's kind of looking close can see that there's a Christmas tree in the back. There's some gifts right there. It's Christmas time. We grew up in a pretty stable working class family. And I say working class with middle class aspirations. If anybody out there knows what that means. So we were definitely living kind of paycheck to paycheck, but we always thought we could attain more. And my mother is the one that gave me that initiative to strive and go forward and do more. That's me as a kid. I was always a bright kid. I was in the gifted classes. And that's me as a young man. And as I grew older, I saw that the way people looked at me changed. And I knew it was because of my race. I knew some people were going to see me as a threat. And it made me think, what does it mean to be Black in America? What does it mean to be Black in Detroit? And I learned very early that the world can judge you very harshly and very, very quickly. And I know that people, they make assumptions. And we have to admit that the world sometimes views African American men and African Americans, period, negatively. And I know that negative view works on a continuum, meaning you got flat out racial hostility here. You've got disdain, you've got dislike, you've got distrust. Some people may think African Americans are more prone to lying, more prone to stealing, more prone to cheating. Yeah, some people even think that Black people are less likely to work, are lazy. And then at the other end of this continuum, you've got the soft bigotry of low expectations. That takes its toll as well. I learned early that it was more important of how I viewed myself. And I knew that the world was going to judge me very harshly, very quickly. I knew that. I'm a big boy. But I knew that it was more important on how I viewed myself. And I learned that very quickly. I view myself as a college graduate. That's how I view myself. I was laughing with Dr. Hussain when we were chatting a bit, and I was selling him. I was putting this talk together, and I had this picture of me and my dad when I graduated from college, and he had just as much hair as I have now. So I saw myself going to medical school. So that's how I saw myself. Saw myself getting married. Saw myself raising a family. I saw myself instilling the same values that my parents instilled in me into my two young sons. I saw myself graduating from fellowship. So did that in 2009 as Dr. Kikuti there to my right. He gave me a lot of input on how to be an interventional cardiologist and how to be a cardiologist. I saw myself coming into a community, saving lives, and helping to build a community. So that's how I saw myself. So heart disease. What is a heart attack? Heart attack is when a blood vessel clogs. It blocks up with plaque, thrombus, and we're able to see that blockage doing something called a coronary angiogram. And once we've established that blockage, we see where it is, and we see that the plaque ruptures, we're able to fix it. We go on with a stent, and we're able to restore blood flow. And that's kind of what I do for a living. And I know I bring my lived experience to that, meaning I bring my own set of biases, and I'm able to admit that I have them, and I'm able to say, what can I do to prevent them? What can I do to not cause any harm to my patients and make them better? And that's why I'm here today, to talk a little bit about health disparities and social inequities. So my lived experience is that I felt the negativity that we talked about. I felt people have disdain for me. And I know that in order for me to do my job correctly, the job we just talked about, I've got to move that needle. I've got to move them from being distrustful. I've got to move them from not trusting me to a positive thing. That's my burden. I know that. And that's what I have to do in order to do my job effectively. I've taken care of people who have a Nazi symbol on the back of their hand. I've taken care of people who have a white pride tattoo. And I know they have disdain for me. I understand that. But in order for me to do my job effectively, I've got to keep pushing. I've taken care of a guy. This is a true story. I've taken care of a guy with the letters HONKY on one hand, MAGIC on the other hand. And if anybody's out there spelling along with me, it says honky magic. This is a true story. So, and I would say, why did you put that on your hand? Because you said, whenever I do something great, I would just go honky magic. I could not stop laughing. He said whenever he made a shot in pool or anything like that, he would just say honky magic. So I've had a lot of lived experiences when it comes to racism and interaction with people. So that's what I kind of bring to the table. And I've seen how it affects others. I will never forget the story of a nurse. She was crying hysterically. And you kind of saw the picture of the cath lab in my office. I walk into the cath lab. I'm about to go into a case, and she's in a corner, crumpled, and she's crying hysterically. She was a nurse that was coming down from the CCU to train and learn how to take care of STEMI patients. And she was not allowed to go into the cath lab room. And I asked her why, and she pointed to her hijab. That's a very true story. And I was so angry. I confronted the patient. I said, you don't want this nurse to be in here while she's training? And she said, no, I just don't particularly care for those people. And then I said to him, but what you don't understand is that I'm a Muslim too. I did say that. That's a very, very true story. And actually, I would have hummed the Muslim call to prayer if I knew it, just to piss him off even more. But I did not. But I made my point that that's not something that I care for. And also, I'm not immune. I have my own biases. I do. My wife will tell you about a time that I was out at a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and I ordered Japanese soup. And my kids could not stop laughing. My youngest son just kind of slumped down in his chair. But that goes to show you that I have my own biases when it comes to other cultures. Sometimes I amalgamate them into one culture instead of seeing them specifically. And, that's not flat out racial disdain, but still that's in that spectrum. And I have to take that into myself and say, what can I do to make myself better? So that's kind of my talk on that subject. This is something I put in there because I think this is something that's going to help us all. And for people out there that are looking and don't know what that stands for, I'm not going to say it out loud, but that's half the answer to a lot of our problems. We need to kind of sometimes be quiet. And here's the full answer. And the AL stands for and listen. Okay? So we need to be quiet and listen. And that's going to help kind of get rid of some of these disparities and racial inequities. And for me, racial disparities are personal. When I look at the members of my family, all of them have been touched by it, everyone. And of those 6 people standing there, only 2 people are alive. My grandfather died from prostate cancer and Alzheimer's, both of which are higher in African American communities. My grandmother, she passed away from a stroke, and we'll talk about the disease statistics there. My mom, she passed away from lung cancer, higher incidence in African Americans. My grandmother, she had a stroke. She's still with us. My grandfather, he passed away from multiple myeloma, and African Americans are higher than likely to get multiple myeloma. The mortality is similar, but we're still higher in incidence. Black Americans have a life expectancy that's 6 years less than white Americans. And that has been little changed within the last 30 years. The disparities affect us from the cradle to the grave. When we look at infant mortality rates, African Americans have an infant mortality rate that's almost 3 times that of Asians and twice what it is for white Americans. Native Americans are almost as high. Most research on health disparities, they look at the maternal and infant mortality. They focus mostly on poverty, low socioeconomic status, decreased access to prenatal care, and poor physical and mental health. When we look at maternal mortality, we still see significant highs as compared to other races. Researchers, they were looking at Florida and found that when cared for by a white physician, Black newborns had a infant mortality rate of 430 deaths, more than expected per 100,000 white newborns. But when they looked at that same population and they were cared for by a Black physician, that infant mortality rate dropped to 173 per 100,000. That was presented just recently, August 17th, at the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. So what does that tell us? Does it tell us that Black physicians are better? I think what it tells us is maybe they bring some of their learned experience to the table. Maybe they bring an understanding of bias to the table. Maybe they're a little bit more culturally competent in that scenario. There were some flaws to the study. It was a retrospective analysis. I'll give you that. There's obviously need for more research, but maybe if we do find that that's the case, that maybe these physicians were doing something just a little bit extra, maybe we need to be teaching that to our medical students. Maybe we need to be teaching that to our nurses. So that brings up another issue that they found in infant mortality and maternal mortality, something called the weathering phenomenon. That's basically where the mom is acting as if she's at a higher maternal age than her stated age. And they think maybe some of this is due to the cumulative socioeconomic disadvantages. So that leads me to my next point. The burdens that people have, they have consequences. Now, when we talked earlier about moving the needle from one area to another, racial dislike, moving the needle from distrust, and that's the burden a lot of people have, that becomes tiresome. Just so you know, and that maybe was behind the weathering phenomenon. So social determinants of health. What really goes into how healthy someone is? What are the major factors? Education is number one. When you look at economic stability, that's another major factor. So let's talk a little bit about education. African-American children are 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended than their counterparts. In particular, African-American males and boys perform poorly compared to white boys and African-American girls in different educational outcomes. Data from 2003 to 2009 indicate that by 4th grade, they score about 30 points lower than their counterparts, and that gap remains until the 8th grade. Research has also shown in mathematics, they score 30 points lower, and that gap actually increases to 40 points, and that persists as well. They're more likely to live in poverty. We're more likely to be in low income. 24%, 41% are poor. There's a group out there called the National Center for Children in Poverty, founded in 1989 as a division of the Melman School of Public Health at Columbia University, that's doing research. They're doing research into an area called resilience. What makes one kid more resilient than another? Why does one kid excel or maintain better than other kids? What are the factors that go into them being resilient. So we showed that some of the kids fall behind or 30 points below, but there are some kids that still achieve. There's some kids that still maintain. What do they have? So they define resilience as the functional competence or optimal development in the mix of exposure to hazards, threats, adversities of any kind. And they found that the protective factors are individual child factors, as you would probably guess, meaning some kids are just really smart. There are family factors. There are social support factors. So when we think about myself, who grew up in Detroit, I had a family. That was my resilience. I had a social network. That was my resilience. When I think about my wife, she has something still new. I've got a niece here at the College of Nursing. Her factors are something similar. When I look at my friends who made it, they've had similar factors to this. All right, let's move on. Criminal justice. Like we said earlier, the world judges you very harshly and very quickly. When we think about the names of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, John Crawford in Dayton, Ohio, they judged them very quickly and very harshly. George Floyd, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor. Black men constitute 6% of the U.S. adult population, but are approximately 35% of the prison population, and are incarcerated at a rate 6 times that of white males. Black male defendants in federal criminal cases receive much more prison sentences than white men. When we look at this graph, we're seeing that if you're getting no time, you're more likely to be white. If you're getting greater than 180 months, you're much more likely to be Black. In federal courts, the average sentence during 2008 and 2009 was 55 months for whites. It was 90 months for Blacks. More than 1 in 4 people arrested for drug law violations in 2015 were Black. Although drug rate use does not differ substantially by race and ethnicity, more people arrested for drugs were Black. For example, the ACLU found that Blacks were 3.7 times more likely to be picked up for marijuana, although the usage rates are very similar. The CDC Project, they made a report to the United Nations saying, what can we do to eliminate some of these disparities? And they found that if we just ended the war on drugs, we could take away some of those disparities. If we eliminated the mandatory minimum sentences, we could take away some of those disparities. If we reduce the use of cash bonds, so we've kind of turned a lot of these courts into debtors' prisons. If we eliminated the use of cash bonds, we would clear out some of those disparities because people would be able to afford to post bail. If we fully fund indigent defense agencies, if we develop and implement training to reduce racial bias, we can get rid of some of those disparities. Also, if we address the collateral consequences of being locked up. So you can imagine that if you've been in prison, once you get out, it's hard to find a job. It's kind of hard to go on living. It's hard to get the things that you need. The other collateral damage is that if you've been in prison, they won't allow you to get any type of assistance. So Anything that can help you further your cause doesn't get done. And there's other collateral damage. It has affected my brother. It's personal for me because my brother has struggled with addiction. He's struggled with mental illness, and he's been in prison multiple times for various things. So you take a guy like me who grew up to be a cardiologist, and you've got my brother who had the same experiences I had, who was just now getting out of prison probably about 3 months ago. So these disparities, they affect real lives. They affect real people. Let's talk about healthcare. So we've talked about education. We've talked a little bit about criminal justice. Obviously, the thing that we all know about is healthcare, and disparities definitely affect us. If we look at the leading causes of death in this country, heart disease, cancer, COPD, asthma, stroke, all of those have a certain amount of disparities associated with them. When we look at the Health in the United States Spotlight, this is a report that was made in 2019, looked at racial and ethnic disparities in heart disease. We saw that death rates for African Americans were 208 per every 100,000 people. For white Americans, it was 168. You can argue that the overall trend has been decreasing for the last 20 years, but still there are disparities that persist. So in 1999, the death rate for African Americans were 337 per 100,000, 156 for white Americans, and that's come down to 208 in 2017 and 85 respectively. When we look at cancer, we talked a little bit about that. The disparities exist there. Invasive breast cancer, non-small lung cell cancer, and colorectal cancer all have significant disparities. Statistics indicate that age-adjusted breast cancer mortality rates are higher among Black women than white women. Population-based studies suggest that while survival rates for women with breast cancer have improved over the past 2 decades, survival rates in Black women have lagged behind, and the observed disparity may be increasing. Black males have a significantly higher incidence rate at almost 1.5 times as likely to die from lung cancer than white males. So that's significant. Similarly, Black men and women have a significantly higher cancer incidence rate and almost 1.5 more times likely to die of colorectal cancer compared with their white counterparts. Again, real lives, real people. COPD. There's data to suggest that it's underdiagnosed in African Americans and undertreated. Stroke. In the US, African Americans have a higher incidence of stroke, more severe strokes, and a higher stroke mortality than whites. The overall crude incidence was 13 per 1,000 in Blacks and 10 per 1,000 in Hispanics and 9 in whites. And here's a graph showing just that. When we break stroke down into cardioembolic, lacunar, extracranial, pretty much, except for cardioembolic, are higher in African Americans. So what are the reasons for these racial inequities? I think some of it has to do with access to care. I think probably the biggest driver is income disparities. When we look at income disparities as broken down by race, the average white family has a total net worth of about 144,000. African American family, 11,000. And that disparity has been pretty constant over the last few years, as you can see. When we look at percentages of households that are owned, we see that white families own a significantly higher percentage than African American or Hispanic families. Then we talk about things like reward bias versus developmental bias. Reward bias is basically focuses on the disadvantages treatments of Black people in informal transactions that limit the rewards for skills and talents presented to the market. Developmental bias refers to impediments that block access for Black people to those resources necessary to develop their talents. When we think about reward bias, we think about things like redlining. We think about decreased admissions to things. When we think about developmental bias, it's more like poorly funded schools and things like that. And that's one of the things we need to really address in this country. In the first half of 2019, only about 13.6% of Black adults were uninsured, compared to 9.8%. So what should we do? I think that's the biggest question. What can we do to kind of break down some of these barriers, disparities? I think we start by seeing each other differently. I think we start by saying there are biases. We admit that they exist. When I look at this picture, I see some of my best friends. And I see an architect. I see a vice president of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. I see a master's of design from the University of Michigan who owns his own design company. I see a lawyer. I see an educator. I see a cardiologist. That's what I see when I see that picture. This is my office. So when I took this picture, my wife was furious. She said, at least you could have cleaned it up. But I kind of wanted to see you guys to see how I live a little bit. And also that there's a framed picture of Martin Luther King. You know, when I see that picture, I see that it looks like he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looks tired. He looks weary. He looks weathered. And I think he's tired and weary from moving the needle. And I don't think there's been a human being alive that's moved the needle more than Martin Luther King. And that's my personal opinion. And he had to move the needle for a whole entire race. And not the Black race. He had to move the needle for the human race. So not only did the American Civil Rights movement help African Americans, but it spurred women's rights, disabled rights, rights for LGBTQ. So that's why I think he looks weary in that picture. But maybe while I'm sitting in my study and I'm reading, and maybe after I've had maybe a bourbon or two, I think he's looking at me and he's saying, what should you do to move the needle? I think he's saying, how have you helped the race, the human race? And when we ask ourselves, what can we do to decrease the amount of disparities? I think we have to ask that question. What have you done? What have you done to move the needle? And what are you prepared to do? He said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think about that quote all the time. So even though there are disparities that still exist, I think if we keep pushing, they'll get better. And he also said that we may have came here in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So I promised myself that I wouldn't get too political, but I think this is good advice. This is from one of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler. Book was called The Parable of the Talents. And she says, choose your leaders with wisdom and forethought. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control the fool. To be led by a thief is to offer up your most precious treasures to be stolen. To be led by a liar is to ask to be lied to. And to be led by a tyrant is to sell yourself and those you love into slavery. And I think that's excellent advice. And there's one more thing I want you to do. I want you to listen. I want everybody to listen to each other. And I want people to hear what other people are saying. Thank you. Oh, so I was given a note. It says that when I finish, please let everyone know that Mani Hussain will be making some remarks. I turn it over.
Great, thank you very much. I'm hopeful that you can hear me, and given that I don't have much on the screen to indicate that, I'll just take that as that this is working. So I'm Mani Hussain. I'm the youngest of Dorothy G. Hussain's 3 kids, and I'm joining you virtually from San Francisco. In a thought to just give some context for why this lecture is so important to our family, and also a little bit about my mom. Thought I might share with you a few things that were important to her, and therefore we reflect on a little bit of what I reflected on as I was thinking about this lecture. The first is patient advocacy, and really putting yourself in the patient's shoes and establishing that connection. I think that's something that, as I think back to our comments around the dinner table and other things that she would say, that was something that I knew was at the core of the nursing that she wanted to do and do well. And given Dr. Dolce's comments and lecture that we just learned certainly a lot from around the importance of connecting with patients and seeing them for the human beings that they are, I'd like to think that she saw this lecture and is agreeing and smiling about the importance of doing just that. The second thing is really about education and mentoring. And one thing that really hit home for me was that my mom always believed that good nurses need to learn from good nurses. And that comes first from a mentoring perspective when you enter the profession, from your peers, and then also to start giving back and taking other people and helping. And this was something that was very clear with the relationships she had with her mentors and also with people who joined the team or joined the department after her, and something that I think was really very important. And the final thing is really institutions, that they have a responsibility to the communities they serve. And while they're not perfect, they do tremendous amount of good work. And she really had a tremendous amount of affection for this institution and really believed in the work done here, both for patients and also in education. Really for those three things, the patient advocacy, the education, and mentoring, and really the value of the institution. I'm very happy that you have all taken some time today to attend this lecture, and a thank you to Dr. Dolce for an excellent lecture on some things that I think we can all reflect quite a bit on. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Wonderful presentation. Wonderful presentation. It's always great to shine light on areas where we, in our everyday life, don't pay attention to. Thank you. And also, thank you, Mani, for finally connecting with us. At this time, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I will introduce them one after another. We have three panelists, and each will have 10 minutes or less to give their presentation. And after that, we will have questions and answers. And Dr. Lewandowski has already mentioned in her opening remarks that how the audience who are remote or virtual can connect with us so that we can entertain their questions. So, Dr. Linda Lewandowski is a professor and dean of the UT College of Medicine. She is also co-chair of University of Toledo President's Opioid Task Force and serves as a vice provost for health affairs for interprofessional and community partnerships. She came to Toledo from College of Nursing at the University of Massachusetts, where she was a tenured professor and had served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. She has significant expertise in multidisciplinary collaborative education, active learning techniques, synchronous distance, and online education. Her work reflects her strong focus on social justice and healthcare for underserved and disadvantaged population. Dr. Lewandowski's research program focuses on violence and cumulative trauma in high-risk groups and high-risk situations. She co-developed the Cumulative Trauma Scale, now translated into 6 languages and used worldwide. She has been a national leader in patient and family-centered care, co-authoring a work on the subject that helped change practice patterns. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing. So please welcome Dr. Linda Lewandowski, Dean Linda Lewandowski.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. I just do want to clarify, for the sake of my fellow Dean, Chris Cooper, that he's the Dean of Medicine. I'm Dean of Nursing. So just wanted to, yeah, but just nursing, medicine, kind of, It's okay. It's a healthcare field. Okay, so I'm really happy to now take a different role, and my job is to do a kind of very quick primer on social determinants of health. We use a lot of the terminology and a lot of the words, and Dr. Dulce did a great job of showing us some of the impact of social determinants. I'm going to just delve a little bit more in depth on what we mean by social determinants and some of the lingo and impact that we're looking at in these determinants. So, first of all, just to define social determinants are conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. The World Health Organization also adds that money, power, and resources at the global, national, and local levels shape these conditions, and that social determinants of health significantly impact health iniquities. So I'm going to show you some various lists of factors that have been discussed when we talk about social determinants of health. Beyond the usual healthcare delivery system. When I was first educated as a nurse, I did not really, I spent a lot of time doing physical assessment, looking at signs, symptoms, but, really talking about, immigration status or life-threatening toxins in the environment of my health, of my patients, or really looking at their access to education. Some of the factors that we now know are crucial in affecting their health, we weren't really looking at those in much detail. Now we're learning more and more how important they are, even more important than some of the things that we used to think were kind of the holy grail of health. So let's talk about what determines health. This is kind of a quick little summary that's been determined to say, okay, what's health? What is your health determined by? So genetics are in there, medical care you receive. Patient choice is the biggest factor. Social factors, environmental factors. So it kind of looks like, well, if social factors are social determinants of health, that's not really responsible for a very big part of our health. But we have to really look at this in much more detail. Patient choices are very much determined by all of the factors that we're going to be looking at that make up social determinants of health. If you have food insecurity, you don't really make necessarily great nutritional choices. You just want something to eat, no matter what it is. If you live in a very violent neighborhood, you may not get a lot of physical activity because that's not really a safe choice. So even our patient choices, definitely our environment, and a lot of social factors. And we also know, in fact, that medical care options that people are offered are often very determined by your race, ethnicity. Not all races get offered the same kind of treatments. There's a lot of research about that, and some of you are probably very familiar with those data. So that really tells us that the social determinants of health factors, if I can make this turn, there we go. We'll talk about them a little more. Okay, so another vocabulary word that is used in talking about social determinants is the meaning of place. And in the social determinants world, conditions, social, economic, and physical, in various environments and settings in which individuals and families live, social, church, workplace, neighborhood, those are what we mean by place. In addition, more material aspects of this concept include social engagement, a sense of security and well-being, because these are also affected by where people live and how they live. So this is a pretty busy slide, but it kind of encompasses the understanding of the relationship between how population groups experience place and the impact of place on health, that it's fundamental to the social determinants of health, including both social and physical determinants. So on the right side, my right, your left, I guess, are another listing of factors that have been identified as social determinants of health. Things like having the resources to meet daily needs, having access to education, economic and job opportunities, access to health care, quality of your education, transportation, social support, exposure to crime, violence, social disorder, residential segregation, language, health literacy we know is very important, access to mass media and technology. And then also some of the physical determinants that are also really important, looking at natural environments, climate change, built environments, housing design, toxic substances, physical barriers, and things like lighting. When I worked at Wayne State in Detroit, we found that one of the best violence prevention strategies was replacing streetlights that had not been replaced for years. And just having light in the neighborhood really brought down crime rates. So Dr. Dorsey showed you this diagram of the social determinants of health in Healthy People 2020. And this is probably the most common picture that we're familiar with if you've looked at social determinants at all. This is a place-based organizing framework. And he talked about many of those factors. Okay, these are the Healthy People 2000 determinant areas. And you can see some of the major categories that go under them. Dr. Dorsey talked about some of these. Economic stability includes employment, food insecurity, housing, instability, poverty, education, not only early childhood education, but enrollment in higher education. We have a lot of first generation college students here at University of Toledo. Whether they finish or not could be a determinant of their income and their health. Language and literacy. You can see the other factors here: access to care, neighborhoods, social and community context. So that was Healthy People 2020, but we're in 2020, right? And so now we have Healthy People 2030. And Healthy People 2030 is a blueprint, really, of what we need to focus on in the health of our nation, what our outcomes should be, what our focus areas should be. And social determinants of health play an even more prominent role in Healthy People 2030. They have pretty much the same 5 areas, although they've changed healthcare to access and quality, and education to access and quality, knowing that those are some of the important aspects of those. So Healthy People 2030 has an increased overarching focus on social determinants. It recognizes that social determinants have a major impact on health, well-being, quality of life, also on health disparities and inequities. And one of the 5 overarching goals of HP 2030 is related to social determinants of health. So we know that this is becoming recognized, these factors, as really crucial for all healthcare providers, not only to know about, but to assess in our patients and to have some follow-up plans. And you'll be hearing some more about that from Dr. Shavanik. We're doing that in the community. So in line with this goal, HP 2030 features many objectives related to social determinants that highlight the importance of upstream factors. So that's another term I just want to share with you very briefly. This is kind of a busy diagram, but the blue part are the upstream factors that kind of looking, upstream. What happens upstream affects what comes down to the river, right? So if you have discriminatory beliefs, certainly we know with a lot of focus on systemic racism, how important that has been in terms of quality of health care, living situation, all of the social determinants, institutional power, social inequities. Those are going to affect the downstream factors that are looking at risk factors like smoking, nutrition, physical activity, violence, chronic stress. We know there are racial inequities in all of those factors, diseases and mortality. So these are some of the factors we need to look at when we're really trying to understand a model of health equity. Some of the economic incentives to address social determinants of health. Okay, if you've been around, the world at all, much change is driven by economics, right? So money, if there's a financial aspect, there's likely to be incentive to change. Okay, that's really driving the social determinants of health focus. Like to say it's all, altruistic care, and, some of it is, but actually there's real financial impact here. So value-based payment plans put more pressure on healthcare systems to reach quality targets and lower the cost of healthcare. Thus, healthcare leaders are increasingly interested in strategies to better understand health and wellness in their populations. You have better health, you have less demand on the healthcare system, you have a better economic outcome in a value-based payment system, right? And I think Dr. Shabanic will be talking a little bit about that too, so build on that. So strategies that leverage social determinants of health data, and really the collection of data is becoming really important to many healthcare systems, including those in our very own community. So some of the goals of standardizing the data collection, standardizing social determinants data within the electronic healthcare system, as many systems are doing, ProMedica, UTMC, other systems around the country, result in these kinds of positive outcomes, improving health, lowering costs, advancing health equity, giving an opportunity to assess the needs and then link patients to community services that we're going to be hearing much more about. Also to develop sustainable business models. So also another aspect of social determinants of health is looking at healthcare policy. There's some philosophical approaches now that are really looking at how do we use health impact assessments to review needed, proposed, and existing social policies. But also an idea of looking for health in all of our legislation, looking at what is the impact of X legislation on health over all of the areas of our government, because whether it's climate or energy, many things that we do, it's hard to find something that we're looking at in a policy that doesn't affect some social determinant of health. So considering social determinants of health in clinical education and policy assessments and decision-making related to health is really what you need to be focusing on these days. We know the impact. We know that health is determined not just by your genes or, who you have, what kind of medical care, although that access certainly is. It's really determined by all of the other factors that we've talked about in your environment. So by working to establish policies that positively influence social and economic conditions and those that support change in individual behavior, we can improve health for large numbers of people in ways that can be sustained over time. Assessing SDOH in our patient populations, taking steps to make referrals, gain services, get resources and support, as Dr. Shabanic is going to be talking about, will lead to better healthcare outcomes and lower health costs. And improving the conditions in which families, individuals, and communities live, learn, work, and play will create a healthier population and society. Certainly, we know that all of these factors have been a factor in our COVID-19. We're going to hear about that next. But I thank you, and hopefully you have a little bit more understanding of the myriad of factors that we include in social determinants of health. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewandowski. Our next panelist is Dr. Jennifer Hanrahan, a graduate of Chicago College of Osteopathy. Dr. Hanrahan was trained in internal medicine at Metro Health Medical Center in Cleveland and subsequently at Case Western Reserve University in the field of infectious diseases. She also obtained a master's degree in public health from Case Western, and prior to coming to Toledo, Dr. Hanrahan served as director of Cleveland Department of Public Health. Currently, she holds an associate professorship at the University of Toledo College of Medicine and Life Sciences and serves as the chief of infectious diseases at University of Toledo Medical Center and medical director for infectious prevention and control at ProMedica. She specializes in the field of emerging infectious diseases. She has served as co-chair of the Society of Healthcare Epidemiology of America, as well as CDC's Outbreak Response Training Program Education Committee. Would you please welcome Dr. Hanrahan?
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about something that I think is an incredibly important topic. I have to say it's very difficult to follow Dr. Dulce, and I really want to thank you for your candor. It was really disturbing statistics to hear, and I'm going to add more to that. So I have to admit up front, I'm really challenged when it comes to advancing slides, so I will probably not get this. But anyway, all right. So I wanted to start off with a story. I'm really happy to be talking to you about COVID-19 and health disparities because I think it's something that just has not gotten enough attention. And people really need to understand what the disparities are. And, we need to stop arguing about whether or not people should be wearing masks because we really need to be protecting people who are vulnerable. So I want to start off with a story of one of the patients that I saw in March. And she really taught me what this epidemic is all about. We have learned a lot about the underlying medical conditions that contribute to people getting more sick and predispose people to having to go into the ICU and dying from COVID. But the socioeconomic factors have not been emphasized. And that's really what this pandemic is about. So anyway, she was an 18-year-old woman. She came into the hospital near the end of March, and she didn't have any underlying risk factors. She was not diabetic. She was not morbidly obese. She didn't smoke. There were none of the things that we associate with worse outcomes in COVID. And she ended up getting extremely sick. She went into the ICU. She was on a mechanical ventilator for at least 2 weeks. She was in the hospital afterwards for about another 3 weeks while she was recovering from one of the things that happens is that people get confused. They develop encephalopathy, and she was sick for quite a while. So she was in the hospital more than a month. She was extremely sick and extremely weak. And again, she had no underlying risk factors. The only thing that she had that led to this illness was that she worked at a fast food restaurant in the drive-through window. And so she was, talking to people all day long at a time when we were telling people not to wear masks. And so she was in the direct line of fire. And she had this job, which was a minimum wage paying job that she had to have in order to be able to pay her bills. And that's why she got so sick, she almost died. So fortunately, she survived. But, that story is not the one that is coming out enough. And so anyway, I want to give you some more statistics. All right, so here we are. We have 8.7 million cases of COVID in the United States, 500,000 in the last 7 days. So anyone who tells you that it's going away or that it's going to disappear, that's wishful thinking. It's clearly not the case. Again, 500,000 in the last week and 225,000 deaths. This is a map of the United States showing you where the cases are currently on the upswing. The states that are darker in color have more cases. So this is not surprising. We know Texas, Florida, California, Wisconsin has had a lot of cases, and then Illinois also is having a lot of cases. But that map doesn't tell you the whole story because you can't color a whole state because it's not the same everywhere. It really depends on county level data. And the county level data depends on zip codes and wealth. And that is really that's the disparity that is going on in this country. So the red areas here are where the cases are really going up. And I think that gives you a slightly different view than looking at the entire country. You can look individually by state. The New York Times has really good data. And you can see the epidemic curves for every state. And what you should notice is they're all going up. All right, this is the morbidity and mortality curve for pneumonia, influenza. We have this data going back to 1976. That black line that looks like a sine wave is basically the baseline seasonal variation that we see with pneumonia and influenza. We tend to see deaths from pneumonia and influenza more in colder months. So usually October through February is when we see a lot of influenza in the Northern Hemisphere. And that red line that you see, that is the seasonal influenza. So you can see in 2017, there was a pretty bad epidemic. It went way above the normal curve. But look at COVID by comparison. So those two blue peaks, that's COVID. So for anyone says that this is like the flu, this is not the flu. This is nothing like the flu. And we don't know where that line is going to, end yet. All right, now this is the only piece of good news I have in my talk, which is that at least the death rate is not continuing to go up. So we have learned something about treating this disease, and so we at least can do something now. So we're doing better when people do come into the hospital. We're much better at being able to make sure that they survive. So that is one good piece of information. All right. So one of the things, that we know is that there are some biological differences for how people get sick, but we don't exactly know what's causing this. So we know that more women are actually being infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. That's shown on the left. But then when you look at deaths, a greater percentage of men are dying. And why that's happening, it's not entirely clear. Some people think that it may have to do with the type of work that they're doing, or it may have to do with some receptors in the nasal epithelium that may be increased in men because of testosterone. It's not clear. I think, we're going to be learning more about this. But I'm showing this just to say, there probably are some biological factors, but that's really not what's accounting for most of what we see. You can look at county level data for the entire United States. This is available on the Centers for Disease Control website, and this is Lucas County. Almost half of the people in Lucas County have an underlying condition that puts them at increased risk for severe illness and dying from COVID-19. And again, you can look, we're not even the worst county in the United States. There's counties where 60% of the population has an underlying health condition. And then you can look at the cases by race and ethnicity, and you can look at deaths by race and ethnicity. And what should jump out at you is that the percentage of cases so white people account for 60% of the population in the United States, and 60% of the cases are not happening in white people, and 60% of the deaths are not happening in white people. So what that means is that minority groups are having a greater percentage of the brunt of this disease, both in terms of cases and in terms of death. And I'm going to show you more clear statistics on this in a moment. And then if you look at deaths, clearly the death rate goes up as people get older. So almost all of the deaths are occurring in people over 50. And you can see that on the left, more cases are happening in younger people, but more deaths are occurring as people get older. And so that's really important, because what that means is that young people need to do everything that they can to help protect older people from getting sick. And again, that whole discussion about the masks and not wanting to wear masks, it is incumbent on everyone to do this so that we protect people who are more vulnerable. What's shocking is this. When you look at age-adjusted hospitalization rates by race and ethnicity, there is huge disparity. So Hispanic or Latino and non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaskan Native are much more likely to end up hospitalized than white people. And that is, when you see this in this kind of bar graph, I think it's really striking what a difference there is. And also this is from the COVID tracking website, which has also a lot of, I think, really impactful visual data. So this statistic, nationwide, Black people are dying at 2.3 times the rate of white people from COVID-19. Now, there's no reason that this should be going on other than health disparities. And so we'll get more to that. But I want to say that this is the thing that should be in the news constantly. And we're not hearing really enough about this. And so, again, I just want to emphasize, there's another statistic on this website that 1 out of 5 Black people in the United States knows somebody who has died of COVID. And, that's a shocking statistic, because I know people who have died of COVID because I've taken care of them as an infectious disease doctor. But I can tell you that in my extended family, no one has been in the hospital. And, that is not true for a lot of people in the United States. So again, there's huge disparities in what's going on. This data also from that COVID tracking website shows you the counties with the 20 highest infection rates. A lot of these are in southern states. But what's more interesting is that when you break this down by when you look at death rates by race and ethnicity, the purple bars are Black or African American. And so what you see is that, again, there's this huge disparity in terms of the death rates. And then New York Times has a really good article that explains the racial inequity of coronavirus. And one of the striking things is that when you look at the cases and deaths for white people, it goes up some with age, but not nearly as much as it does for minorities. So there's a much bigger death rate as age goes on for Hispanic or Latino and for African American people. All right, so why is this happening? One of the main reasons is work. There's work inequity. And so what happens is that people who are poorer, who have jobs that don't pay as well, they don't have options about staying at home, and they don't have flexible work schedules, and they may not be able to make the choice to not go to work and stay at home. So people have to continue to go to work, even if it means that they're potentially risking their lives to do so. And that's probably the single biggest factor that is contributing to what's going on. Interestingly, this was an article that was published in JAMA, and they looked at 92 different hospitals in the United States. And what they found was that although current reports suggest that Black patients represent a disproportionate share of COVID infections and deaths in the United States, for those able to access hospital care, there was no difference between Black and white patients after adjusting for socio-demographic factors and comorbidities. So what that means is that there is insufficient access to health care, and also I think saying adjusting for sociodemographic factors and comorbidities, you can't really adjust away all of the underlying factors. You can't adjust all the comorbidities. There is an excessive number of comorbidities that undoubtedly have to do with the stress of living in our society. All right, I just want to mention that it's not just deaths from COVID, it's also deaths from other things. At least a third of the deaths that have happened have actually been related to myocardial infarctions and for diabetic foot infections and other things that we were normally seeing in the hospital before COVID. And for a while, we stopped seeing altogether because people were afraid to go to the hospital because they thought they would get sick with COVID while they were in the hospital. And I'm still hearing people telling me that they were reluctant to come in because they thought that they might get sick in the hospital. So the other thing is we've seen an increase in alcohol use, and we've also seen an increase in opiate overdoses during this pandemic. So it's not just the pandemic, it's also the collateral effects of the pandemic that we're seeing. All right, so what accounts for the disparities in infection and fatality rates? It's the conditions in which people live and work that are the main risk factors for exposure to SARS-CoV-2. Greater population density, like you see in poorer neighborhoods, means that people are less likely to be able to socially distance appropriate. They may live with more people and not be able to, so older people or people at risk may not be able to protect themselves adequately. And then, as I mentioned, people continue to go to work, even if it potentially puts them at risk. And then there is a disproportionate burden of comorbidities in poorer people. And then there's other things like Dr. Dulce mentioned, like unfair lending practices and increased risk of imprisonment. certainly are contributing to increased cases as well. So there's a differential risk for those who can work at home, for those who cannot. More public-facing jobs for poorer people, again, disproportionately African-American and Latino. Testing is less accessible in Black and brown communities than it is in white neighborhoods. And basically, the pandemic has exacerbated and highlighted social inequities in access to healthcare. I heard a talk the other day where someone said that we are, this statement that we're all in the same boat is not true. Some of us are in yachts and some of us are in canoes. And it's, I think that was a good way of picturing this. So Dr. Lewandowski talked about health equity. This is the World Health Organization definition that I really like. Equity is the absence of avoidable, unfair, or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically, or by other means of stratification. Health equity or equity in health implies that ideally everyone should have a fair opportunity to attain their full health potential, and that no one should be disadvantaged from achieving this potential. And the only possible, good thing from this pandemic is that maybe it gives us an opportunity to realize the importance of health equity. And, the fact that we're still discussing whether or not people should have access to healthcare, whether it should be universally available in 2020, is somewhat shocking. And I also won't get political, but I'll just leave. I think you can figure out where I come from. So, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a beautiful presentation, capsule. Our last speaker on the panel, let me get this out of the way. Our last speaker is Dr. Kelly Shavanek. When she came in, I asked her how she pronounces her name, and she taught me, but I forgot. Kelly Shavanek. She is the System Director for Care Navigation at ProMedica. She studied nursing at the University of Toledo. We are very proud of her, where after obtaining a bachelor's degree, she went on to obtain a master's of science in nursing. Earlier this year, she graduated with a doctorate in nursing practice from Chamberlain University in Downers Grove, Illinois. Dr. Shavanek is board certified nurse executive through the American Nurses Association, and she is member of the Case Management Society of America. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Kelly Shavanek.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. So it's such a pleasure to work with these panelists and to be able to present with them as well. It's my hope that I'll be able to highlight the work that my care management team did during the pandemic to mitigate some of the risk for these vulnerable patients as they were transitioning between levels of care from the hospital to home, from ER to home. So I'm speaking through the care management lens during this portion of the presentation. So I think we talked about this a lot tonight, but just want to highlight that these health disparities are preventable differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or in the opportunities to achieve optimal health. So it's preventable, and that's why I highlighted it and underlined it, and I think the other speakers certainly highlighted that as well. So Dr. Hanrahan just said very wisely that healthcare access and utilization is one of the areas where we have an opportunity to mitigate the risk of these vulnerable patients as they're experiencing healthcare through the pandemic. So that's really what I'm going to focus on here for this presentation. And so I mentioned that I'm going to be speaking through the care management lens. So I wanted to define care coordination. Care management, case management, care coordination is all really used interchangeably. But the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, they refer to care coordination as involving the deliberately organizing patient care activities and sharing information among all the participants concerned with the patient's care to achieve safer and more effective care. So care management is really a linear process, and it spans across the continuum of care, and it's fluid. So our patients in our healthcare system, they experience this care across the continuum. And so I actually have a responsibility for our care management strategy that spans from ambulatory and our primary care practices to each of our 11 hospitals within our discharge planning, and also Paramount, which is our health plan for the elite and Medicare and commercial products. And the transitional care management, so transitional care happens when patients, vulnerable populations, are transitioning between levels of care. And that paradigm has shifted, and I like this visual. I'm a visual person, but it's a staircase that never really ends. And that's purposeful because the care shouldn't start or stop when a patient is leaving our brick and mortar locations. Patients, you mentioned, we all bring our lived experiences to this. Patients also bring their lived experiences to the healthcare system when they enter, and the social determinants of health certainly impact their outcomes when they leave. So we have to deliver care in a way that's coordinated and in a way that's connected across the continuum. And that's what our team was able to achieve working within the interprofessional team during the pandemic. And this is a busy slide, but I came across an article that highlighted the common transitional care management pitfalls into these 5 areas. And the 5 areas that they say that we need to be really aware of when we're managing transitions of care are effective communication between team members, engaging the patient and family in the discharge planning so they're not passive participants in their healthcare journey, establishing and maintaining trust, connecting them to the appropriate resources, and providing transitional care management support. So when thinking about this and how our care management approach precipitously, and that's the right word to use because it literally happened when our CNO called me and said, Kelly, I'm concerned about our PPE and conserving it. Can you shift to a virtual model? And I said, we'll get it done. And if you would have told me in January we'd be able to do that, I would have thought that was not feasible, but our team did it. And so we had to think about effective communication between team members. We leveraged technology different. Our team was able to facilitate interdisciplinary transition rounds in a virtual way. And we were exchanging important information across the continuum of care in a virtual approach. Patient engagement, so that remains central through this. Patients are in the driver's seat for their discharge planning. And we actually shifted to that remote model and were able to perform a telephonic care management assessment, assessing the patient in a holistic, comprehensive way, including taking those social determinants of health into account as we're working with them to develop care plans that are going to mitigate the risk for those vulnerable populations as they're transitioning. And we recognized very early that there was a gap, and one of the gaps was communication. We had visitors were not able to visit their loved ones in the hospital, and that communication with the family members of hospitalized patients was oftentimes not sufficient. So we developed a family communication team, and we employed ambulatory nurses, some of them being in outpatient surgery areas when they weren't seeing a lot of volumes. And what we did was we sent them referrals or consults, and then they provided outreach to the family members of hospitalized patients so that the family could remain up to date and a part of the discharge planning process. So over a period of 8 weeks, we addressed 139 of these referrals. and included those family members in that update. So, and then one of the other pitfalls for discharge planning is that trust between patients and healthcare team members. And I like this the statement that it exemplifies the belief in another's good intentions and will. So our care management strategy definitely had to incorporate the art of nursing and social work into this, especially through a virtual approach where we couldn't read body language and things to communicate. And we were able to still engage our patients effectively to promote self-care management, which is the ultimate goal of care management. So conveying compassion and emotional intelligence telephonically is much different skill set for nurses and social workers doing the discharge planning. But I was hearing stories anecdotally day after day of us having, for example, end of life care, goals of care types of conversations and other conversations that we couldn't have even imagined having effectively telephonically. It's humbling. So connecting patients with post-acute skilled nursing facilities remains a challenge in the pandemic environment. So CMS and a lot of managed care payers, they've loosened some of the regulations and requirements for patients who are transitioning from a hospital to a skilled nursing facility. However, the skilled nursing facilities continue to scrutinize every single referral that we're sending their way, and for good reason. CMS issued guidance for the SNFs to isolate patients for 14 days. And logistically, some of them have semi-private rooms. Geographically, they couldn't accommodate that. Some of them do not have sufficient PPE for that. And then also, and probably more significantly, according to our SNF partners, that staffing in SNFs has been historically a challenge prior to the pandemic, and now even more so as the SNFs have been impacted so significantly by this. So our solution, one of our solutions to remain abreast of this as it's changing very rapidly and constantly, is we developed a SNF database. We rely on those strong relationships with our skilled nursing facility partners, and we keep this updated with their most current information. Are you accepting COVID-19 patients, recovered patients? What are your parameters? Because it varies by SNF and by day. So I wanted to highlight the work in these three areas because these are pretty progressive, pretty profound projects that we worked on with our interdisciplinary team members to mitigate the risk of poor outcomes during transitions of care. So the first one is that our home health, ProMedica Home Health, we extended telemonitoring services for individuals with congestive heart failure and chronic and COPD. For patients, it's usually provided within a home health episode, but they were actually providing it outside of a home health episode to help to mitigate the risk for them. So our current census today on our telemonitoring platform is 154 patients. They get an experienced registered nurse to monitor daily biometrics that the patients are at home inputting data. This was exceptionally useful when our heart failure clinics were really targeting the most at-risk patient population during the height of the pandemic, but continues to be a very successful intervention right now today. So this is Eric. So Eric is our social worker in the Toledo Hospital Emergency Department. And this machine that he has next to him is lovingly called the Eric, or called the social worker on wheels at the Toledo Hospital. And what he's able to do with this is he's able to provide remote psychiatric assessments for patients who present in our emergency room with psychiatric with needs in the psychiatric area. He can cross-cover in other emergency departments and lend support in psychiatric service area, do consultations with providers, and make recommendations for care plans. This is going to continue to be a huge area of opportunity as we have yet to see the sequela during the pandemic. And the third one is oxygen. So very early in the pandemic environment, we worked with our home medical equipment experts, and they set up a consignment closets throughout all of our 11 hospital emergency rooms. And we can very easily and seamlessly connect patients with home oxygen supplies to help to expedite their transition from the emergency to home if and when that's appropriate, thereby potentially even avoiding a hospitalization. And that's really important for capacity and throughput in a pandemic environment. So between April through October, our home medical equipment company told me that they have set up 878 oxygen patients throughout our 11 location geography for home oxygen. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip if I'm. Yep, thank you. So, and then finally, I just want to highlight some of the work that we've done in our transitional care efforts after the patients leave the ED or the hospital. So we worked with our system incident management team experts to develop this algorithm. We have nurses still today calling patients at a very intensive cadence who have been diagnosed with a COVID-19 diagnosis. Between days 8 through 14, we're actually calling them daily and providing nursing triage. We're triaging their symptoms. Yep, so we're using evidence-based guidelines. They're constantly being updated and changing, and we're triaging and providing care advice to ensure that they're able to stay at home safely, or to help to triage them back to the emergency room if that's appropriate. One more. Sorry, the clicker's not. Okay. And so finally, it's been my honor to work with these individuals. These are some of the faces prior to the pandemic, so they're not masking here. But these are some of the individuals on our care management teams across the continuum who have been responsible for this work. And this is the most resilient team, thinking about resilience, the most resilient team I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And their work has been profound. The stories that have come of this have just been so touching. So I wanted to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions here. We are running a little bit short on time, but I'm going to use the prerogative of the moderator to add about 15 minutes. But my request would be to the panelists that please make your answers brief so we can accommodate more questions. I will start right now. Dr. Hanrahan, you have a question. What have the overdose death rate been found to be now? Have they gone up?
Yes, the opioid overdose and substance abuse in general has gone up.
So the panelists, when they answer, are they visible on the screen? Okay, magic. So I have a question which I will refer to Dr. Dorsey as well as to Dr. Hanrahan. What can health professionals do to decrease racial disparity?
Briefly stated.
Dr. Dorsey.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. I think the main thing that we can do is we can listen. And we brought that up in my talk is just basically listening. And I think God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we listen. And sometimes by listening, you're able to come up with a better diagnosis. You're able to flesh things out a bit better. So that would be my first thought. And the second thing would be become culturally competent. Learn from the people around you. Learn Learn about the different faiths in your community, Muslim faith, Jewish faith. Learn a little bit about the Latino community. Learn a little bit about the African American community. Learn about other communities that are different from yours. So I think that'd be my main thoughts on how to decrease racial disparities and healthcare disparities.
Dr. Hanrahan?
Yeah, I obviously agree with everything Dr. Dulce said. The other thing I would encourage people to do is develop empathy. Realize that, we're all much more alike than we are different. And we all have families. We all have people whom we care about. We all have people who love us. So, learn to actually figure out what people's stories are. Don't just look at them as a disease. You should look at people as humans and realize that we all have, we have basic needs. All of us do. And we're all very similar.
So when the two panelists say that we agree with each other, I am a little bit disappointed. I want some fireworks. Disagreements. Come on. So, Linda, there is Dr. Lewandowski, excuse me for,
Okay.
I call you Linda in private anyway. There's a question for you. Is there any one thing you can think of what would help a new nurse understand disparities? Do we have anything in the curriculum?
Well, we have a lot of things in the curriculum, so hopefully that is part of our education as we go forward. I think that the most important thing is to not assume that we know where our patients are coming from, that we need to ask questions as well as listen, to ask about where people live, what their accommodations are at home, what kind of transportation, how did they get to the clinic? We get annoyed if people are late but don't realize it took 3 bus transfers. I think really being open to asking questions and learning about our patients as individuals and families and communities that may be different from ours, and not making assumptions that we already know what their life experience is about.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions, Dr. Hanrahan. They are sort of tied in. The first question is, what are the effects of COVID during pregnancy? And the second question is, can a mother with confirmed case of COVID breastfeed?
Yeah, so those are great questions. Pregnancy is one of the risk factors for worse outcome and for hospitalization. And we know that there's a lot of changes that take place during pregnancy, especially in the 3rd trimester. There's less lung volume, so that probably increases the risk. And we know that that's a risk factor for hospitalization. Fortunately, there have been very few cases in infants, and there have been very few maternal deaths. So that's a very good thing. Early on, we thought that women should be completely separated from infants at birth, but we don't think that anymore. So it's very important for women to be able to bond with their child, with their newborn. Breastfeeding has all kinds of health benefits. And so there are some infection control measures that are put in place to try to help, protect the baby. But actually, now it is encouraged.
So can you spell out what makes a pregnant woman more vulnerable? What is it in the physiology which causes that?
Yeah, so there's a selective T cell deficiency that happens in pregnancy. So T cells are important for fighting viruses and fungal infections. And, basically and I'm saying this as a woman who's been pregnant. I have 2 daughters, ages 21 and 20. So when women are pregnant, you have to think of it as having like a parasite. So there's some immune tolerance that goes on, and so there is some immunodeficiency. So we know that women are at increased risk for certain infections, but there's physiologic changes that take place. Importantly, there's less lung volume because of pregnancy. So as pregnancy goes on, you just can't breathe as well. And we know that with COVID, one of the things that we found is that when people are able to lay, if they are sick with COVID, if they're able to lay on their bellies, so they're able to lay in a prone position, there's more oxygen. You can't lay on your belly if you're pregnant. So, you know, I think it's mostly the physiologic changes that take place.
Dr. Dolce, you have a fan in the audience. Jane Cosmina writes, she says,
Jane.
Dr. Dorsey, greeting from another Wayne State University graduate.
Awesome. Nice.
My God, your reputation
Warriors.
Your reputation has really spread. Since COVID-19 is affecting Black and brown persons disproportionately, how can we get representation in clinical trials? And mentions about active trials at the National Health Institutes, etc.
That's a great question. When they're looking at vaccine trials, and Dr. Hanrahan, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I know they've struggled to enroll African-American people. I think getting out and educating the community is the best way to do that. And you have to go to where they are. I mean, if they're having a virtual church service for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, then maybe having a short snippet about vaccine trials and how that can help African Americans and getting people to enroll. Maybe dropping off some pamphlets at a local barbershop would help. So I think we have to get the word out to the people, get it to where they are, and talking to them in a language that they understand. And don't talk down to people and tell them that, this is good for you, this is going to be great for you, but meet them where they're at. And Dr. Hanrahan, if you want to add any more to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I just want to add that, so remdesivir is a drug that was just recently approved for COVID-19. And we actually tried to get clinical trials locally, but by the time that we were able to get medication, it was actually available by expanded use. So we certainly made it available to anyone who had severe or critical disease. There were some clinical trials going on with other medications. I have to say there hasn't been anything very promising so far. And in fact, we keep reading about clinical trials closing down because they're showing that they're not effective. But with regard to the vaccine, you can go online and you can actually look up, you can volunteer to get the vaccine when it becomes available or to participate in a clinical trial. And I completely agree. I think it's really important to have representation, especially from people that are most vulnerable. So I think it's very important for people to participate in clinical trials.
Dr. Dorsey, does COVID-19 affect the heart?
Yes, actually it does. So it can cause myocarditis. That's probably the most sensational thing that we've been talking about. There was a study of Big Ten athletes, football players who were infected with COVID-19, and they saw about 40% of them can develop a myocarditis. They use a specialized MRI to scan these players, and they were able to see that. We also see a whole range of other issues. We see tachyarrhythmias. About 25% of the patients infected with COVID-19 may have some type of tachyarrhythmias. There's been some talk of bradycardias associated with COVID-19, so it definitely can affect the heart.
It does not affect valvular, it's the valves.
No,
it's
not like
myocardium.
Endocarditis. This is more of a myocardium. And just to kind of talk a little bit about what we're saying, so when we think about the heart, we kind of divide it into several different systems. We divide it into a plumbing system. We divide it into a structural system like valves. And also we divide it into a pump and an electrical system. So you've got a pump which actually pumps the blood to the body, and that's the myocardium. That's the actual muscle. And the COVID-19 can cause a myocarditis or an inflammation of that.
Tell us again,
sure,
that what percentage of COVID patients
will
get cardiac complications?
So that's a great question. So with the study within the Big Ten, there was about 40% of the athletes developed some degree of myocarditis, and that was picked up on MRI. Now, whether that would translate into clinical symptoms is a little bit different. So these were people that were directly studied, so they may not have had any clinical symptoms of heart disease, but we were able to see evidence of that with the specialized MRI. The other point I would probably want to make is that we think that COVID can cause strokes. It can increase cytokines and thicken up the blood, and we're seeing a little bit more strokes, particularly in younger people. And Dr. Henry, what's been your clinical experience with that? Just want to.
Yeah, so definitely we know that COVID causes increased blood clots, and when they've done autopsies on people who haven't survived, they've seen lots of unrecognized blood clots in the lung. And certainly there's people are presenting with just stroke who actually don't have any symptoms of COVID, but then test positive for COVID. And so, it's clearly a consequence of that. There's increased heart attacks because of, the increased propensity to clot. And, you may have heard of COVID toes. That's thought to be also related. So it's an inflammatory state.
I'm going to add a question.
I just want to add one other thing. So just really quick. So I had a patient that actually presented with COVID, did fine, went home, ended up getting a bacterial pneumonia about a month later. And that bacterial pneumonia caused sepsis and then endocarditis or an infection of the heart valve. So COVID can not just directly affect the heart.
Secondary effects.
There's a whole lot of secondary effects.
Yeah. Dr. Henderhan, why do they develop clots, these patients? And the second thing is, what is so magical about type O blood type, which protects people from COVID?
Yeah, so you're asking me basic science questions that I can't answer, but I will just say that there's a theory that your blood type may affect how you respond, and people who have type A blood may have worse outcomes than people who have other blood types. What the basis is for this, I have no idea. And why it's so inflammatory, I also don't know that answer. We just know that this is one of the things that we're seeing. And I would also add that, people are having really like Dr. Dulce said, it's not just the COVID, it's also people are having really prolonged symptoms. So they can have fatigue, they can have, some memory impairment. I mean, there's other things that happen after people get COVID. So it can go on for a really long time, and we're just starting to learn about the long-term effects.
So if I may interject an editorial comment, and that is, the disease was unknown, at least in the US, before February or January. From January until this time, what we have learned about this disease is enormous. We have not learned everything about it, but compared to many other infectious diseases in the past, and it has taken a long time for us to come to the point where we understood the epidemiology, the pathology, the symptomatology, and not to mention how to take care of them. So this has been on fast track, and specialists like you have done a tremendous job in helping us understand what this pesky little virus does. So there is a question for Dr. Shavanik. What is the geographical radius of pandemic for ProMedica facilities with Toledo as a center? How far you reach?
Yeah, so I'll do the best I can with this. But so we go up into Michigan. So as far as Tecumseh now, to Monroe and Coldwater in Michigan. And then we have hospitals here in Metro with Bay Park and Flower being in Sylvania and Oregon. And then as far as Fremont in Fostoria as well. So pretty much like Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan.
Southeast Michigan, okay. So there are a few questions which are all related to vaccine. And I wondered if Dr. Hanrahan would be so precise to tell us when this vaccine will be available. This is first question. But a tandem question is that is there a cross immunity with other viruses of the COVID family?
So the first question, we're supposed to have it before the election, right? So that should be any moment now.
We'll get together here on May the 3rd and revisit.
But so the vaccine, I mean, there are candidate vaccines that are fairly far, in terms of clinical trials, but realistically, I don't think that we're going to have a vaccine that's going to be available for a lot of people for a while still. I think there are people that are optimistic that think we may have it by the end of the year. I don't have any special insight into when it will be available, but, just in terms of, what's likely, I think we're looking at spring before it's going to be widely available. Healthcare workers probably will be offered the vaccine sooner, just because, because they're in the healthcare setting and potentially more in contact. Your second question was, whether there's cross immunity from other coronaviruses. There probably is some, but how much we don't know. It's interesting. We have learned a lot about antibody development to this particular virus, and it's not really behaving like SARS-1. When people had SARS-1, they developed antibodies that lasted for 3 or 4 years. With MERS-CoV, they get antibodies that last for several years. With this, we know that antibodies can go away after a few months. So we don't really know everything that we need to know yet. And we don't know whether you get cross protection from other coronaviruses, but I'll just say that other coronaviruses are circulating all the time. And clearly, it doesn't provide enough protection, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this pandemic.
So there is a structural difference between this virus and some other viruses which lend themselves to vaccination on a permanent basis, smallpox, for example, or others. So this is we don't know much about it at this time, or there are two different type of viruses.
Well, so the one major difference, smallpox, there is no animal reservoir. So smallpox is only in humans. And if you have a virus that has an animal reservoir, it's incredibly difficult to eradicate. So one of the things that you need, that's one of the reasons we haven't been able to eradicate influenza, for example, because it circulates in birds all the time, and pigs and other animals have influenza. And coronaviruses are in animals as well. So, the likelihood of being able to eradicate it is low. But I anticipate that we'll have a vaccine. It's probably not going to be a vaccine that's going to completely prevent infection. It may decrease the symptoms, like other viruses or other vaccines that we have, like influenza and varicella, et cetera.
Okay, well, that brings us close to our program, and I wish to thank Dr. Dorsey, Dr. Lewandowski, Dr. Hanrahan, and Dr. Shavanik for your wonderful presentations and your answering these questions. I just have one comment, and this one person wrote, he says, excellent information and great speakers. Thanks to everyone. And I add my thanks to you all.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain, and thank you to all my colleagues, speakers. We had almost 600 people join us this evening, and so we really want to appreciate all of you who really understood the importance of the topics that we're talking about tonight. We have a lot of challenges ahead, but working together, we can continue to make a difference as we focus on social determinants of health, elimination of health disparities, and social inequities, especially those that have been particularly highlighted during this COVID pandemic. I want to just also add that I'm going to give you some CE information in a minute, but next week on Thursday evening in response to a question someone had about has the COVID pandemic made the opioid epidemic worse? Absolutely, it has. It's increased overdoses and deaths. And so in my hat as a co-chair of the UT Opioid Task Force, I want to invite you to this also wonderful town hall that's going to happen next Thursday. We're going to send you all an email, all of you 600 plus people who signed up this evening. So if you're interested, we invite you to this important discussion. So as we end our session today, for those of you who would like to obtain continuing education credit, you can now see the link and the code for the CE listed on the screen. The link has also been shared in the chat box. So please take time to copy this information prior to exiting the event. You have until November 24th at 11:59 p.m. to be exact to complete this evaluation. If you start the evaluation prior to 11:59, you will not be closed out until you finish, unlike the federal government if you are submitting a grant, and they have no mercy. So we're a little nicer. You will be getting your CE certificates sent out periodically from Pam Rice. If you get an email from her, that's probably because you're getting your CE certificate between now and December 11th. So thank you again for attending the 13th annual Dorothy Hussain Lectureship. Many thanks again to our keynote, Dr. Dorsey, my fellow panelists, our great moderator, Dr. Hussain. We look forward to seeing you again next year, maybe in person, although we got a lot of people this year, so we may relook at that. It's great that so many of you could join that maybe weren't able to in person. And we sort of look again to Dottie for all of her inspiration as we take on the challenges ahead. So thank you very much. Stay safe, take care, and have a great evening.